So happening today, a family of 41-year-old Virginia mother stabbed to death last month by an illegal immigrant is set to hold a press conference demanding accountability from the Democratic officials they say failed her. Emails reveal he was warned about the illegal migrant suspect, a violent offender with more than 30 prior arrests, but still released him before the crime. Back in November, police emailed, quote, "Mr. Jalloh is one of the repeat and violent offenders we discuss. I wanted to get your background on why he's out so soon." Unfortunately, based on the numerous dealings with him, it is not a question of if, but rather when he will maliciously wound or worse again.
She was just waiting for a bus. That is all Stephanie Minter was doing on the day her life ended. Not walking down a dark alley at midnight, not in the wrong place at the wrong time in any way that the phrase is typically meant. She was standing at a bus stop in Fairfax County, Virginia, one of the wealthiest, most developed, most supposedly safe counties in the entire United States, doing something millions of Americans do every single day without a second thought. She was waiting, and she never made it home. Stephanie Minter was 41 years old. She had a mother who loved her, a woman named Cheryl, who had spent 4 decades watching her daughter grow, laughing with her, worrying about her the way mothers do, building a life alongside hers. See, 41 years of birthdays and phone calls and ordinary Tuesday afternoons and all the 10,000 invisible moments that make up the architecture of a relationship between a mother and her child. Gone, at a bus stop, in broad daylight, in one of the safest counties in America. The man charged with killing her is named Abdul Jalloh. And the moment you begin to pull on that thread, the moment you start to look at who Abdul Jalloh is, what his history looks like, how many times the system had him in its hands and let him go, the story of Stephanie Minter's death stops being just a tragedy. It becomes something worse. It becomes a story about a system that saw this coming, a system that was warned, in writing, that this man would kill someone if he was released again, a system that released him anyway. So this is not just a true crime story. This is a story about what happens when the machinery that is supposed to protect ordinary people fails so completely, so repeatedly, and so deliberately that a woman ends up dead at a bus stop while the people responsible for keeping her safe look the other way. This is the story of Stephanie Minter, and the question that every single person watching this needs to sit with from the very beginning is not just who killed her, it is who let it happen. To understand what happened to Stephanie Minter, you have to start where every story like this actually starts. Not at the crime scene, not at the moment of violence, not at the bus stop in Fairfax County where a 41-year-old woman took her last breath on an otherwise ordinary day. You have to start at the beginning of the failure, and in this case, the failure has a name, a face, a history, and a paper trail so long and so damning that by the time you reach the end of it, the word negligence will feel entirely too small for what it describes. Abdul Jalloh did not appear out of nowhere on the day he killed Stephanie Minter. He did not emerge from the shadows as some unknown, undetectable threat that no one could have anticipated. He was not a man who slipped through the cracks of a system that simply had no way of knowing what he was capable of. He was known. Thoroughly, extensively, repeatedly known. By the time Stephanie Minter died at that bus stop, Abdul Jalloh had accumulated more than 30 arrests. 30. Not one prior incident that might be explained away as a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. And not 2 or 3 run-ins with law enforcement that could be framed as a pattern still developing. 30 arrests. A criminal history so long and so consistent that it did not resemble a man occasionally crossing the wrong side of the law. It resembled a man for whom the law had simply ceased to function as a deterrent, because for Abdul Jalloh, it had. Every single time the system caught him, it let him go. Every single time law enforcement brought him in, processed him, documented another entry in a file that was already thick with prior offenses, something happened. Or rather, something failed to happen. The consequences that are supposed to follow from a criminal history of that magnitude, the escalating accountability that the justice system is designed to provide, and the simple and fundamental principle that a man who has demonstrated 30 times over that he poses a danger to the people around him should not be walking freely among those people. None of it applied to Abdul Jalloh. And the reason it did not apply is where this story becomes something more than a crime story. It becomes a story about policy, about politics, about a set of deliberate decisions made by people in positions of power that created the conditions for Stephanie Minter's death long before she ever stood at that bus stop. Abdul Jalloh is from Sierra Leone. He is not an American citizen, and his immigration status sits at the center of a chain of decisions that, link by link, built the circumstances that would ultimately cost a 41-year-old woman her life. In November of 2018, a Fairfax County law enforcement turned Jalloh over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. This was not an unusual step. When a non-citizen with a serious criminal history comes into contact with law enforcement, notifying federal immigration authorities is a standard part of the process in jurisdictions that cooperate with ICE. The logic is straightforward. If someone is in this country illegally and has demonstrated a pattern of violent or criminal behavior, federal immigration authorities have both the legal authority and the responsibility to detain that person while deportation proceedings are initiated. ICE took custody of Abdul Jalloh on November 27, 2018. What followed was a legal and bureaucratic ordeal that lasted nearly 2 years and ended in a way that almost defies belief. ICE held Jalloh for 702 days. 702 days in federal immigration custody, while authorities attempted to arrange his removal from the United States. The destination was Sierra Leone, his country of origin. The problem was that Sierra Leone would not take him back, and no third-party country could be identified that would accept him either. Under a Supreme Court ruling that governs immigration detention, the federal government cannot hold a non-citizen indefinitely for the purpose of deportation, if there is no realistic possibility that deportation will actually occur. If removal is not imminent and no clear path to removal exists, a judge can order the detainee released. That is exactly what happened with Abdul Jalloh. After 702 days in ICE custody, a judge ruled that he could not be removed to Sierra Leone or anywhere else, and ordered his release. The Department of Homeland Security later explained the situation with a bluntness that carries its own particular kind of horror. ICE, they said, can only detain individuals for the purpose of removal. Without the possibility of removal, without a country willing to accept Jalloh back, there was no legal basis for continued detention. And so a man with a sprawling criminal history, a man who had been flagged as a danger to the community, a man whom federal immigration authorities had spent nearly 2 years trying to remove from the country, walked out of federal custody and back into Fairfax County, back into the same community where Stephanie Minter was living her life, back onto the same streets where she would one day be waiting for a bus. But here is where the story takes a turn that moves it beyond the realm of federal immigration policy and into something far more local, far more specific, far more preventable. Because the failure of ICE to deport Abdul Jalloh, as infuriating and as consequential as it is at least a failure that has a legal explanation attached to it. A judge ruled. A law was applied. The system, however imperfect, was operating within its own constraints. What happened in Fairfax County after Jalloh was released from ICE custody is something different entirely. What happened in Fairfax County is a choice. Fairfax County operates under what is called a trust policy. The policy, implemented by the county's Board of Supervisors, it effectively prevents Fairfax County law enforcement from proactively alerting IUCE when individuals with immigration violations come into contact with the local justice system. In practical terms, what this means is that when someone like Abdul Jalloh is arrested in Fairfax County, when he cycles through the local court system for the 8th time, the 15th time, the 20th time, the county's own policy prevents police from picking up the phone and calling federal immigration authorities to say, "This man is here, he has a record, and we think you need to know about it." The trust policy was designed by its supporters as a measure to build trust between immigrant communities and local law enforcement. The argument is that if undocumented immigrants fear that any contact with police will result in immigration consequences, and they will be less likely to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, or seek help when they need it. It is a policy argument that has genuine complexity to it. Real communities, real considerations, real trade-offs. But in the case of Abdul Jalloh, the trade-off looks like this: a man with more than 30 arrests, a man who had already been through the federal immigration detention system, a man who was, by any measurable standard, a repeat offender with a documented pattern of dangerous behavior, and a county policy that tied the hands of the very law enforcement officers who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he was capable of. Those officers, the Fairfax County Police, who had encountered Jalloh repeatedly, who had processed his arrests, and who had watched him cycle through the system and return to the streets again and again, were not silent about what they believed would happen. They put it in writing. Fairfax County Police issued written warnings to the prosecutor's office, stating clearly that Abdul Jalloh would likely kill someone if he was released again. Not a verbal concern passed between colleagues in a hallway. Not an informal expression of unease. A written warning, documented, official, delivered to the office of Commonwealth's Attorney Steve Descano. Let that sit for a moment. The police, the people on the ground, the people who knew this man's history better than anyone, told the prosecutor's office in writing that releasing Abdul Jalloh would likely result in someone's death. And Steve Descano's office released him anyway. So the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office did more than simply fail to act on those warnings. According to Virginia Attorney General Jason Miyares, Descano's office had a formal, written policy published on the Commonwealth's Attorney's own website, stating that wherever possible, charging and plea decisions would be made in ways that limited or avoided immigration consequences for defendants. Read that again. A formal, written policy, published publicly, stating explicitly that the office would factor a defendant's immigration status into its charging decisions in ways designed to protect that defendant from immigration consequences. Virginia Attorney General Miyares did not mince words when describing what that policy means in practice. It means, he said, and that a citizen with 30-plus arrests would not have received the same treatment as Stephanie Minter's killer. It means that Abdul Jalloh, by virtue of his immigration status, received preferential treatment from a prosecutor's office that was supposed to be equally accountable to every person in Fairfax County. It means that the scales of justice in Fairfax County were not balanced. They were tipped, deliberately, by policy, in favor of a man with a criminal history longer than most people's resumes, and against the safety of the ordinary citizens, people like Stephanie Minter, who had every right to expect that their government was working to protect them. Cheryl Minter, Stephanie's mother, has her own way of describing what the system did to her daughter. She said these vicious criminals are repeatedly put back on the streets again and again. She said it with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has had to learn, in the worst possible way, how the machinery of local government actually works. who has had to sit in rooms with politicians and attorneys and advocates and absorb the full, devastating picture of exactly how many people made, exactly how many decisions that led, step by step, to her daughter standing at a bus stop in Fairfax County on the last day of her life. Cheryl Minter had her daughter for 41 years, and then, because of a trust policy and a prosecutor's written commitment to protecting criminal defendants from immigration consequences, and a federal system that could not deport a man to a country that would not take him back, she didn't anymore. And the bus stop where Stephanie Minter died is still there. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of place you pass without looking twice. The kind of place where nothing is supposed to happen. But something did happen there. There is a particular kind of anger that does not burn hot. It does not explode. It does not arrive in a rush of heat and noise and immediate visible fury. It is quieter than that, slower. It is the kind of anger that builds in layers, accumulating over time like sediment at the bottom of a river, invisible on the surface, growing heavier by the day, until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. That is the anger of Cheryl Minter. She is not a politician. She is not an attorney or an activist or a person who spent her life navigating the corridors of power or understanding the mechanics of prosecutorial policy or immigration law. She is a mother, a woman who raised a daughter for 41 years and then received the kind of phone call that no parent is ever prepared for, the kind that rearranges every room in your mind permanently, the kind that turns every memory into something simultaneously precious and unbearable. And in the weeks and months after Stephanie's death, as Cheryl Minter began to understand, really understand, in full and devastating detail, exactly how the system had failed her daughter, that quiet, layered anger became something else entirely. It became a demand, not a request, not a plea, a demand, and the kind that comes from a place so deep and so certain that it cannot be negotiated with or redirected or softened with the language of bureaucratic sympathy. Cheryl Minter began to speak publicly. She began to sit in rooms with attorneys general and victims' rights advocates and members of the press and say, plainly and without flinching, exactly what she believed. That the people responsible for her daughter's death were not just Abdul Jalloh. They were the people who let him go. To understand why Cheryl Minter's accusation carries the weight that it does, to understand why it is not simply grief talking, not simply a mother looking for someone to blame in the aftermath of an unthinkable loss, you have to look at the timeline, the full timeline. Because the timeline of Abdul Jalloh's interactions with the Fairfax County justice system is not a story of a system that tried and failed. It is a story of a system that was told exactly what would happen and chose a different priority anyway. After Jalloh was released from ICE custody, following those 702 days of federal detention, he returned to Fairfax County, and he did not stop accumulating arrests. The pattern that had defined his criminal history before his ICE detention did not pause or slow or show any sign of the kind of behavioral change that might justify the repeated leniency he was receiving. He kept coming into contact with law enforcement. He kept being processed through the system. He kept being released. And the Fairfax County Police, the officers who knew his file, who had watched this cycle repeat itself more times than should have ever been permitted, kept raising the alarm. Those written warnings to the prosecutor's office were not issued once. This was not a single moment of concern expressed, and then forgotten. The warnings were documented, delivered, and ignored. Police told the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in writing that Abdul Jalloh was dangerous, that releasing him posed a direct risk to the community. That based on everything they had observed and documented across his extensive criminal history, they believed he would kill someone if he was not kept off the streets. The response from Steve Descano's office was, in effect, silence. Not silence in the literal sense. There were presumably conversations, case reviews, to charging decisions made through the ordinary machinery of the prosecutor's office, but silence in the sense that matters most. The warnings did not change the outcome. The charges were managed in ways that minimized consequences. The man walked. Again and again, the man walked. Now it is important at this point to examine who Steve Descano is and what his office represented in the context of Fairfax County's approach to criminal justice. Because Descano was not simply a prosecutor making individual case-by-case decisions based on the specific merits of each situation. He was a prosecutor operating according to a philosophy, a defined, publicly stated, formally written philosophy about how his office would approach certain categories of defendants. That philosophy, as Attorney General Miyares pointed out, was published on Descano's own website. The policy stated that wherever possible, the office would make charging and plea decisions that limited or avoided immigration consequences for defendants. This is worth examining carefully, because its implications extend far beyond the Abdul Jalloh case. What this policy says, in plain language, is that a defendant's immigration status is a factor that the prosecutor's office will actively consider when deciding how to charge them, and that the office will, wherever possible, make decisions that protect non-citizen defendants from the immigration consequences that would normally follow from a criminal conviction. On its surface, some people might view this as a humane approach, a recognition that the immigration system can be brutal, that deportation can be devastating. Now that the consequences of a criminal conviction for a non-citizen extend far beyond what a citizen would face for the same offense. But here is what that policy looks like when it is applied to a man with 30-plus arrests and a documented history of dangerous behavior. It looks like preferential treatment. It looks like a system that is, by its own written admission, applying a different standard to defendants based on their immigration status. Not a higher standard, a lower one. A standard that prioritizes protecting a non-citizen defendant from immigration consequences over protecting the citizens of Fairfax County from the danger that defendant poses. And Attorney General Miyares made a point that is as simple as it is devastating. A citizen with 30-plus arrests, he said, would not have received the same treatment. You think about that. A Fairfax County resident, a person born in this country, living in this community, paying taxes, going to work, standing at bus stops, with 30-plus arrests would have faced the full weight of prosecutorial accountability. There would have been no policy consideration directing the office to limit the consequences of their criminal history. There would have been no framework designed to protect them from the natural legal outcomes of their behavior. But Abdul Jalloh was not a citizen. And so the policy applied, and Stephanie Minter is dead. There is another layer to this story that runs parallel to the prosecutorial failure and intertwines with it in ways that made the ultimate outcome almost structurally inevitable. And that layer has a name, too. Sheriff Stacy Kincaid. Kincaid is the Fairfax County Sheriff, the person responsible for overseeing the county jail and, critically, for deciding whether to honor what are called ICE detainers. An ICE detainer is a formal request from federal immigration authorities asking a local jail to hold a non-citizen for an additional period of time, typically 48 hours, after they would otherwise be released, so that ICE agents can arrive and take the person into federal custody for immigration processing. Detainers are not mandatory. Local jurisdictions have the legal authority to decide whether to honor them or not. And in Fairfax County, Sheriff Kincaid made a decision. After 2018, her office stopped honoring ICE detainers. Let the significance of that sink in fully. And after 2018, the same year that Abdul Jalloh was turned over to ICE and began his 702-day stint in federal detention, the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office adopted a policy of not honoring ICE detainer requests, which means that even if ICE became aware that Jalloh was in county custody after his release from federal detention, even if federal immigration authorities submitted a formal request asking the county to hold him so they could take him back into custody, the sheriff's office was not going to honor it. The gate was open, and it was open by design. When you place these two policies side by side, Descano's charging philosophy that explicitly prioritized limiting immigration consequences for non-citizen defendants, and Kincaid's decision to stop honoring ICE detainers, what you see is not two independent policy choices that happen to coexist in the same county. What you see is a system, a coherent, interlocking set of decisions that, together, created an environment in which a man like Abdul Jalloh could accumulate 30-plus arrests, receive written warnings from police about his danger to the community, cycle through the local justice system repeatedly, and never face consequences serious enough to remove him from the streets permanently. The Fairfax County Board of Supervisors provided the structural foundation for all of it through the trust policy that prevented local police from proactively alerting ICE about individuals like Jalloh. 3 layers of protection, not for the community, but for the man who would go on to kill one of its members. And the people sitting inside those layers of protection, Descano, Kincaid, the Board of Supervisors, were not unaware of what they were doing. They were not operating blindly, without information, making decisions in a vacuum. The police had told them, in writing, that this specific man, Abdul Jalloh, with his 30-plus arrests and his federal immigration history and his documented pattern of dangerous behavior, was going to kill someone. They were warned. They chose their policy anyway. Cheryl Minter sat in a room and said something that no amount of political language or bureaucratic explanation can fully absorb or adequately respond to. She said she had her daughter for 41 years. She said she does not know what she is going to do without her. And then she said something else, something that cuts through every layer of policy discussion and prosecutorial philosophy and immigration debate and lands with the full, unmediated weight of a mother's grief transformed into moral clarity. She said she blames them, not abstractly, not in the vague, generalized way that people sometimes assign blame to systems and institutions when the human beings inside those systems are too diffuse or too protected to hold individually accountable. She named them: Kincaid, Descano, the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, the specific people who made the specific decisions that built the specific environment in which her daughter's killer was free to be her daughter's killer. She blames them. And the evidence, the paper trail, the written warnings, the published policies, with the 702 days of federal detention that ended in release, the 30-plus arrests that ended in leniency, suggests that her assignment of blame is not the irrational lashing out of a grieving woman looking for a target. It is, in fact, the most rational possible response to an irrational set of failures. But the story does not end with Fairfax County, because what happened to Stephanie Minter did not stay local. It could not stay local, not in the political climate of Virginia in 2025 and 2026, not with a new governor who had already begun making decisions that pointed in a very specific direction, not with an attorney general who was watching those decisions with visible alarm, and not with a mother who was willing to stand in front of cameras and microphones and say plainly what she believed had happened to her daughter and why. If the death of Stephanie Minter had become something larger than one case in one county. It had become a reckoning, and the question of whether that reckoning would produce anything, any real change, any real accountability, any policy shift significant enough to mean that the next Stephanie Minter might not have to die at a bus stop waiting for a world that was supposed to protect her. Reckonings are strange things. They arrive with noise and urgency. Press conferences and statements and cameras pointed at people in suits standing behind podiums, voices raised to the precise pitch of outrage that the moment seems to demand. They generate headlines and social media posts and cable news segments and the particular kind of political energy that builds quickly and burns visibly and makes it feel, for a moment, like something is genuinely about to change. And then, very often, they quietly don't. The machinery of government is extraordinarily good at absorbing outrage, at processing it, managing it, redirecting it through the long corridors of committee hearings and legislative sessions and policy reviews until it emerges on the other side as something smaller and more manageable. A modified regulation here, a strongly worded statement there, the appearance of accountability without its substance. The people who built the system that failed Stephanie Minter are very familiar with those corridors. They have spent their careers inside them, which is why the question of whether Stephanie Minter's death would produce genuine, lasting, structural change, or whether it would be absorbed and managed and eventually filed away in the same bureaucratic machinery that allowed her killer to walk free 30-plus times, was not a question with an obvious answer. It was a fight, and that fight was already underway. Virginia Attorney General Jason Miyares had been watching the situation in Fairfax County long before Stephanie Minter's name became part of the public conversation. He had been watching Governor Abigail Spanberger since the moment she took office, specifically since the first decisions she made in her new role became clear. And those first decisions alarmed him deeply. So Spanberger's early actions as governor included banning the Virginia State Police and the Virginia Department of Corrections from collaborating with ICE, reversing the policy that had been in place under her predecessor, Governor Glenn Youngkin. Under Youngkin, state law enforcement agencies had worked alongside federal immigration authorities as a matter of course. Information was shared. Detainers were honored. The cooperation that ICE depends on to function effectively in any given state was, at the state level at least, operational. Spanberger ended that. In the first days of her administration, before addressing virtually any other priority, she signed orders that severed those cooperative relationships between Virginia's state law enforcement apparatus and federal immigration authorities. Miyares did not hide his reaction. And her first goal in office, he said, was not to protect Virginia citizens. It was to protect convicted felons sitting in Virginia prisons and not to notify federal immigration authorities of where they were so they could leave this country. These are not the words of a politician being carefully diplomatic. These are the words of an attorney general who believes, with evident conviction, that the governor of his state has made a decision that will cost people their lives, that the policy she implemented in the first days of her administration, before the cameras had fully turned away from her inauguration, before the ordinary business of governing had even properly begun, represents a fundamental inversion of the first responsibility of anyone who holds public office: the responsibility to protect the people. But Miyares was not finished. And because sitting on Spanberger's desk at the time he was speaking was a bill, a piece of legislation that, if signed into law, would take the sanctuary-style policies that Fairfax County had implemented locally, the trust policy, the non-cooperation with ICE detainers, the entire framework that had allowed Abdul Jalloh to cycle through the system indefinitely, and extend them to every locality in Virginia. Every single one. Not just the urban counties that had chosen to adopt these policies independently, not just the jurisdictions whose boards of supervisors had decided that non-cooperation with ICE was the approach they wanted to take. Every county, every city, and every sheriff's office in the Commonwealth of Virginia, from the largest metropolitan jurisdiction to the smallest rural county, would be required to adopt the same framework that had existed in Fairfax County when Stephanie Minter was killed. The discretion that local sheriffs currently had, the ability to make their own decisions about whether to honor ICE detainers, whether to cooperate with federal immigration authorities, whether to prioritize the safety calculus of their specific communities in the way they saw fit, would be gone. Miyares put it plainly. Right now, he said, it is their discretion. Spanberger wants to take away that discretion so that the sheriff of Bedford, the sheriff of Galax, the sheriff of Grayson or Washington County would have to adopt the same criminal first. A victim-last mindset that has been adopted in Fairfax. The mindset that has harmed so many innocent Virginians. Criminal first, victim last. 4 words that, in the context of Stephanie Minter's death, carry a weight that no amount of policy language can cushion or qualify, because that is exactly what the Fairfax County system produced. A man with 30-plus arrests was repeatedly prioritized, his immigration consequences managed, his detainers ignored, his written danger assessments set aside, while the citizens of Fairfax County absorbed the risk that those decisions created. Stephanie Minter absorbed that risk at a bus stop. And now, the question before Virginia was whether the governor would sign a bill that would make that same framework mandatory across the entire state. Miyares was still waiting, he said, for the moderate Abigail Spanberger, who had run as a candidate to make an appearance. So far, he said, she was nowhere to be found. There is a political dimension to this story that is impossible to ignore and important to handle honestly. Because the debate over sanctuary policies and ICE cooperation and prosecutorial discretion around immigration consequences is not a simple one. It does not belong entirely to one side of the political spectrum, and the people who support these policies are not, in most cases, motivated by indifference to public safety. They are motivated by a genuine belief, supported by some research, that immigrant communities are safer and more cooperative with law enforcement when they do not fear that any contact with police will result in deportation. That the trade-off, in aggregate, produces safer communities. That is a real argument. It deserves to be engaged with honestly rather than dismissed. But the case of Abdul Jalloh and Stephanie Minter forces a question that the aggregate argument has difficulty absorbing. What about the specific cases where the policy fails catastrophically? What about the man with 30-plus arrests and written police warnings predicting his lethality who cycles through a sanctuary policy jurisdiction until the day he kills someone? What accountability exists for that specific outcome? What mechanism is in place to identify when the general policy is producing a specific, identifiable, preventable catastrophe, and to intervene before the catastrophe occurs? In Fairfax County, the answer to those questions was none. There was no mechanism. There was no intervention. There was a written warning from police that was received and set aside. There was a formal prosecutorial policy that explicitly prioritized immigration consequences over public safety outcomes. There was a sheriff who had stopped honoring ICE detainers, and there was a county trust policy that prevented the officers on the ground, the ones who knew exactly who Abdul Jalloh was and exactly what he was capable of, from doing the one thing that might have changed the outcome. Picking up the phone and calling ICE. That is the specific, concrete, heartbreaking mechanics of how Stephanie Minter died. Not in the abstract, not as a casualty of a broad policy debate, but specifically. A phone call that was not made because a policy said it could not be made. A warning that was not acted on because a different policy said immigration consequences should be avoided. A detainer that was not honored because a sheriff had decided, after 2018, that honoring detainers was no longer something her office would do. 3 policies. 3 decisions. 1 woman dead at a bus stop. Into this landscape stepped the voices that Cheryl Minter had gathered around her in the weeks and months following her daughter's death. Because Cheryl did not grieve in silence. She could not. She is the kind of woman, and you understand this the moment you hear her speak, who transforms unbearable loss into unbearable honesty, who takes the thing that destroyed her and holds it up to the light and demands that everyone in the room look at it clearly. She was joined by victims' rights advocates and by the American Border Story Organization, a group that had been documenting cases like Stephanie's, cases where individuals with immigration violations and serious criminal histories had been released back into communities and gone on to commit violent crimes, and demanding that the human cost of sanctuary policies be acknowledged and addressed. Jennifer Harrison, the executive director of the Victims' Rights Reform Council, stood alongside Cheryl Minter and made a demand that went beyond Virginia, beyond Spanberger, beyond Fairfax County. She called on the President and Congress to establish a Victims' Rights Reform Commission, an independent review board that would give victims the power to file complaints against prosecutors, judges, and failed policies. See, a board with real authority to investigate, real power to enforce consequences, real teeth, in other words, the kind of accountability structure that might mean that the next time a police department issues a written warning that a specific man will kill someone if released, the people who receive that warning cannot simply set it aside and return to their preferred policy framework without consequence. It is a proposal born directly from the specific and particular way that Stephanie Minter's case unfolded. Because the gap that killed her was not just a gap in policy, it was a gap in accountability. The people who made the decisions that led to her death, Descano, Kincaid, the Board of Supervisors, faced no formal mechanism of consequence for those decisions, and there was no body with the authority to review what they had done and hold them responsible for the outcome. There was only Cheryl Minter, standing in a room, saying their names. And that brings us, finally, to the place where every story like this one ultimately arrives, the place beyond the policy debate and the political argument and the legislative fight over what gets signed and what gets vetoed and what gets passed and what gets tabled. The place where Stephanie Minter is simply a person who is gone. She was 41 years old. She had a mother who loved her with the particular depth and specificity that 41 years of shared life produces. Not the abstract love of an idea, but the concrete, detailed, irreplaceable love of someone who knew exactly how her daughter laughed, exactly what her voice sounded like on the phone, and exactly what it felt like to be in a room with her. Cheryl Minter said she had her daughter for 41 years. She said she does not know what she is going to do without her. There is no policy response to that sentence. There is no legislative fix, no executive order, no reform commission or independent review board that reaches into the space that Stephanie's absence has carved in her mother's life and fills it. That space is permanent. It will be there every morning Cheryl wakes up, and every night she goes to sleep, and every ordinary moment in between, when the force of what she has lost arrives without warning, which is to say, constantly and forever. What policy can do, what accountability can do, what the reforms that Miaris and Harrison and Cheryl Minter herself are demanding can do, is something smaller than that, on something that feels almost inadequate against the scale of a mother's grief, but something that matters enormously nonetheless. It can try to make sure it does not happen again. That the next Abdul Jalloh, the next man with 30-plus arrests and written police warnings about his lethality and a federal immigration history and a pattern of behavior that every person in the system can see clearly, does not get released back into a community because a policy says his immigration consequences must be protected. That the next written warning from police officers who know exactly what they are looking at does not get filed and forgotten in a prosecutor's office committed to a different priority. That the next sheriff who receives an ICE detainer request for a man with that history does not set it aside because of a decision made in 2018 that was never revisited in light of its consequences. That the next woman waiting for a bus in Fairfax County gets to go home. That is what accountability looks like in a case where the perpetrator is already in custody, and the system that enabled him is still operational. Not vengeance, not the satisfaction of a verdict in a courtroom, though that too will come for Abdul Jalloh in the form of his second-degree murder charge. But the slower, harder, less dramatic work of changing the conditions that made the crime possible. Cheryl Minter is doing that work. Every room she walks into, every camera she faces, every time she says her daughter's name in public and refuses to let the story be reduced to a statistic or a policy footnote or a talking point in a cable news segment, she is doing that work. She is making sure that Stephanie Minter remains a person, not a case number, not an example, not a cautionary tale deployed in a political argument and then set aside when the argument moves on. A person, with a name, with 41 years of life that mattered, with a mother who is still here, still speaking, still demanding that the world reckon with what it allowed to happen at a bus stop in Fairfax County, Virginia. Stephanie Minter deserved to come home that day. She deserved decades more of ordinary mornings and phone calls and all the invisible, irreplaceable texture of a life being lived fully and freely in a county that was supposed to keep her safe. She deserved better than what the system gave her. And the very least we can do, the absolute minimum that honesty requires, that decency demands, that the weight of her absence makes necessary, is to say so, clearly, loudly, and without stopping. If you want to support victims' rights reform and demand accountability for policies that put communities at risk, the Victims' Rights Reform Council and the American Border Story Organization are actively working on these issues. Their work is ongoing, and in a case like this one, ongoing work is the only kind that means anything. Rest in peace, Stephanie Minter. Your story is not over. Your mother is making sure of that.